you all for coming. It's really a treat to get to speak to a group like you and to get fed at the same time. It's wonderful food, so thank you, all of you responsible for it. And thank you for bringing me here to Charlottesville. Jim's been schlepping me around all over town. And I got off the plane yesterday, and we went straight to Monticello, which was really exciting. I was very actually pleased to see all the hemp plants that they've retained from Tom Jefferson's time. But it's a beautiful place. And actually, I should probably, now that I've been here, the most fun I've ever had writing a book was this one. This is about, I just finished it, I couldn't resist. This portrays George Washington as a gay pot smoker and has Tom Jefferson growing hemp, which they did do all on the road, raised hemp. And, it's amazing among the many insanities of our society that hemp is illegal. I had the amazing opportunity in January of speaking to a Tea Party group. They wanted a discussion of nuclear power, strangely enough. And so I took my 10-year-old daughter to a bar on the east side of Columbus, and there were 60 of these people who are all American citizens, by the way. And I listened for more than 45 minutes previous to my talk. The opener to my talk was a rant of 45 minutes, and this guy had a PowerPoint and slideshow and the whole deal on how global warming is a total myth, and that it's a conspiracy to take away our automobiles and to impose a one-family, one-child policy. Now, this was music to my ears because I have 5 kids. So I was able to get up there and say, well, I've done my part. And here's the proof, my 10-year-old, But I was trying to figure out how I was going to lead off with this Tea Party group. And these people were fierce. I mean, they are very well informed, or at least they're informed. They are up on the issues, let's put it that way. Or down on the issues, if you want to put it that way. But so I decided, and I got up in front of them, and the last thing on earth they expected to hear. First of all, they'd never seen a guy from Greenpeace. I am a senior advisor to Greenpeace, which means I am the oldest person in the organization. And I also have the most kids. So I got up and I just led off with legalizing marijuana. And they were stunned with the silence. None of them could say anything. Sure, a few of them do smoke pot. But it's clearly a civil libertarian issue. And not a single peep out of this group. Every one of them agreed that marijuana should be legal. And you know who else has said marijuana should be legal? Glenn Beck, of all people, has come out for legal marijuana. I was floored. I mean, he must have smoked it in the institution that they had him before they took him to Fox News. But at any rate, and I will say I am going to lead off again saying that I think the legalization of marijuana is a hugely important issue. And it is an issue that has to do with Solartopia and with alternative energy. Because marijuana itself is a big deal. When you have tens of millions of people across the country doing something that is, has been made illegal, you have the basic recipe for a police state. And we've had, almost 40 years now of the drug war, and all it's resulted in is the largest prison population on earth, with a terrible, disruption of the Bill of Rights, huge expense. We have the largest prison population by number and by percentage of population in the history of the planet. There's over 2 million people in jail in this country for drug-related offenses, including marijuana, which is, as far as I'm concerned, a beneficial herb and a proven antidepressant and fights glaucoma and all these other things. But behind the marijuana issue, and by the way, I think most of you know there will be a referendum in California this fall to legalize pot. My favorite event that has happened in recent months is that as a result of the impending referendum, which many people think will pass, the marijuana growers in Mendocino County in California had a public meeting to discuss what the legalization of marijuana would do, because it was going to drop the price of marijuana, and the entire economy of Mendocino County is based on on marijuana growing. And this was a major crisis. You have to give him credit for foresight, to have a meeting like this. And since, it is legal for medical marijuana, the medical marijuana industry in California is now $1 billion industry. And, if you stub your toe and go to the doctor and get a card, you can buy pot. This is also true in Colorado. I haven't been out there recently, but I'm told there's people on every corner in Boulder selling medical marijuana. But what nobody's discussing is that marijuana is not the big issue. The big issue is hemp. There's no doubt that Tom Jefferson raised hemp. Every farmer in the colonies raised hemp. It was, a stable cash crop. George Washington, who was quite an advanced agronomist, farmer, has extensive diaries about raising hemp, including there's one very famous entry where he basically chides himself because he forgot to separate the male and female plants. There's only one reason to do that. But at any rate, right, some of that is going on. So, by the way, I stopped smoking pot 30 years ago. Smoking pot, for me, reminds me of George W. Bush, because it gives me a headache and makes me paranoid. So I don't do it anymore. But the issue of hemp is much bigger than marijuana. Germany, Japan, China, Canada, it's legal to raise hemp. And it's for clothing, for rope, for sales, and especially for paper. It's very important for paper. Hemp can make 5 times as much paper per acre as trees do, and we're deforesting the entire planet for trees for paper. Very, very horribly wasteful, and a tremendous problem. There are many people the conspiracy theorists believe that that's why marijuana was made illegal in the first place, because the Hearst family had huge investments in forests that they were cutting down for paper. They did not want to compete with hemp. Now, I don't know if that's the case, but that is a theory. But in terms of Solartopia and in terms of energy, hemp is a hugely important crop. It's the ultimate biofuel crop. In this day and age, we do not want to be using corn and soy to make fuel. You don't want people competing with automobiles in order to eat. And the fact is that the corn ethanol industry has raised the price of corn, which has a tremendously negative impact on people in Mexico and elsewhere, for whom corn is the staple of their diet. And corn is a very, very inefficient crop to be raising for fuel. I've seen basically between 1 and 1.5 unit of energy comes out of ethanol for every unit of energy that goes in to raise corn. It's a very, very counterproductive way to get biofuels. Soy is a little better, actually. Soy diesel is more efficient in terms of the energy that goes in versus the energy that comes out. But hemp is, as some of you may know, you can take a handful of hemp seeds and throw them in the ground and come back in the fall, and unless the feds have gotten there first, you'll have 8-foot plants. It takes no pesticides, no herbicides, no chemical fertilizers, and not much water to raise hemp plants. And this, for cellulosic ethanol and for the use of the seeds for oil, it is a tremendously promising crop for biofuels. And it would get us off corn and soy right away, which is very important as far as I'm concerned. So the teabaggers didn't have anything to say about all of it. They sat in kind of silent awe about that one. And then they talked about nuclear power. And what's that? Oh, I'm sorry. I don't have a mic. I could use an amp. Do people want an amp, or can you hear all right? I always love it when they ask you if you can hear in the back. Because, what? Are you all right? Okay. Hi there. Come on down. Third row and up, please. Here's a spot right here. I can look at your penguins. Are you guys okay? All right. So, Elena, you're good now?
Yeah.
All right. I started talking about nuclear power, and what do you want to talk to teabaggers about nuclear power? Radiation? Yeah, only real men are not afraid of radiation. Environmental damage? No, they seem to like environmental damage. It brings the end of times the end time's closer, talking about money and federal stuff. I mean, where is atomic power coming from? It's coming from federal subsidies. The only way they can build new nuclear plants in this country is to get federal subsidies. I just put a piece out, it's on the internet, it's called Will the Climate Bill Nuke Earth Day? And we are on Thursday, this Thursday, facing the unveiling, probably, of the climate bill. And the climate bill, most likely, by all indications, is going to contain very large packages of financial federal loan guarantees to build new reactors. This is the only way they can do it. And the teabaggers hate this stuff. They don't want federal money. There's no way that the marketplace is going to support atomic energy because it's not economical. The first commercial reactor opened in Shippingport, Pennsylvania in 1957. And at the time, they thought they were going to solve the nuclear waste problem. They haven't, obviously. They thought they were going to get they thought private investors would step forward, and they haven't. And they thought they would get private liability insurance, and they haven't done that either. And so the teabaggers on the economic stuff, you know, the last thing they want is a federal program to support a technology that can't make it in the marketplace. And so what we're looking at now in the Obama, Kerry, Lieberman, Graham climate bill, most likely, is a very substantial package of federal loan guarantees for new nuclear plants. Now, what's this all about? Well, let's back up a little bit. When we first started fighting nuclear plants, it was in the early 1970s, and I was living on one of those hippie communes in western Massachusetts. We started in 1968. We were an offshoot of the anti-war movement. J. Edgar Hoover had a big hand in our moving there, and you can ask me about that later. You know, the war, we actually were written up, we started, the first and probably the only decision we made as a group in all the years we were there was to not use chemicals on our garden. And so we were organic gardeners right from the start, even though we had no idea what we were doing. We had the good fortune, we inherited a very large barn, and in the bottom of the barn was several tons of cow manure. It had been a dairy farm. And we didn't know it at the time, but this is one of the great legacies that we picked up there. And so we were able to do it without any fertilizers. It was a great thing. But by the early 70s, we were getting a little, it's only, we finally figured out what broccoli was, and arugula wasn't around yet, but, and we realized if in the upper field, if you grow the corn and the marijuana together, then, it's harder to see the marijuana, that's companion planting. So, all that worked, but we were getting a little bored, and then in the late 1970s, 1973 at the end, the utility company announced they were going to build a nuclear plant 4 miles from our house, and we were thrilled because, this was something we were going to beat, and we knew we were going to beat it. We coined the phrase no nukes, and in fact, we did beat them. We never got the bulldozers in, and where they were going to build the plant is a nature conservancy. And you can go to this perfectly preserved spot on the Connecticut River and lay there and think and remind yourself that you might have been in the reactor containment vessel, and instead you're lying perfectly peacefully looking at the sky in a pristine area. So back then, the nuclear industry really thought that they were going to move ahead, and their phrase was too cheap to meter. Nuclear power is going to be too cheap to meter. They had 70, 80, 90% approval from the country. Nobody really questioned the safety of these reactors with any significance. And nobody thought about radiation coming to these plants, except a few of us hippies. And in 1974, Richard Nixon got on national television in the midst of the Arab oil embargo and said there'd be 1,000 nuclear plants in the United States by the year 2000. Now, for a state like Virginia, that would be 20 or 30 maybe, based on population. Can you imagine 20 or 30 commercial reactors in Virginia at 1,000, 1,500 megawatts apiece? Multiply North Anna and Surrey by 5 maybe, and that's what we're looking at. When Nixon made that speech in '74, there were about 250 reactors, commercial reactors, either online, under construction, or on order. And from the day he made the speech, the numbers started going down. where is Richard Nixon now that we need him? But many of them did have some private financing when they were building. And most of the people who privately financed them just took a total bath. And in fact, in the late 80s, early 90s, you may remember the whole deregulation situation, where the utilities went in after California, after Enron raped and pillaged California. They went into as part of it, actually. They deregulated the utilities. Are you deregulated in Virginia?
Yes, re-regulated.
Now they re-regulate.
They re-regulated.
In order to have the ratepayers and taxpayers cover a coal plant and
Right. So here's how that really worked. The reason they deregulated about half the states. What they did when they deregulated, as you know very well, is they picked up all the cost overruns on the nuclear plants. All these reactors were not properly advertised. They had huge debt attached to them. They called it stranded costs. And their argument was, how they do this with a straight face, I guess I have to go to law school to be a corporate lawyer. But what they did was they said, okay, we're going to have competition, which everybody knew was utter nonsense. There's no competition in the electric power business, any more than there's competition between streets, for God's sakes. And these are public utilities, right? So they said, okay, we're going to have open competition. But in order for us to have open competition, these nuclear plants are at a disadvantage because they have debt. So we have to have the public pay off the debt. And the public, under the deregulation scam across the country, paid off about $100 billion worth of nuclear-powered debt so that the nuclear plants can compete. And now they've turned around and said, utilities with a straight face say, look how cheaply these nuclear plants generate electricity. Having totally unloaded their capital costs on the public through deregulation, now they're refiguring all the numbers and they're saying, oh, well, these are really cheap plants, we got to build more of them. But this time around, because of the experience of the 70s and 80s, when all these, some of the reactors, the Seabrook plant was originally going to be $250 million for 2 reactors, and it wound up costing $7 billion for 1 reactor. It's a cost overrun of a factor of more than 30. Shoreham came in at $7 billion and never operated. Perry, all these other, Perry, they put in several $100 million on Unit 2 and just walked away. Same at Seabrook, actually. They walked away from Unit 2. So the experience of the banks in the 70s and 80s, the average cost overrun of a nuclear plant in the 70s and 80s was basically double. Whatever if you average them all out, even the smaller ones that came online fairly quickly, relatively speaking, they cost twice as much as originally projected. And so, Wall Street has said very clearly that they're not going to invest without total government backing in any new nuclear plants. And it's been very clear right for the last since Three Mile Island, basically. None of them want to get into it. They've also said, by the way, and this was a shocker to the Teabaggers, because none of them knew any of this stuff. There's no private liability insurance. I don't know if I'm telling you anything you don't know, but the fact is that when the Atomic Energy Commission in 1954 started pushing the idea of the Peaceful Act and telling the utility companies, the private utility companies here, that they should build new nuclear plants. The utility companies came back and said, if there's a meltdown, we're out of business. So we're not going to do this. And so the Congress turned around and passed what's called the Price-Anderson Act in 1957. How many of you heard of it? Okay. So I'm preaching to the choir, but some of you don't know all the music. So in 1957, the Congress said, well, okay, the federal government will assume the liability in case of a major disaster. You guys, you commercial guys, you put up, and they came up with a number of $560 million at the start, which was ridiculous. It's a drop in the bucket as to what would happen in case of a major nuclear disaster. And so say you put up 560 together somehow, and we will put up the rest. So if there's an accident that does $100 billion worth of damage, which they knew could happen easily, there were plenty of reports on it, The utility companies are liable for $500 billion, and then what happens to the rest? The Congress decides how much to pay individual homeowners. So if you have a home down in from North Anna, and then you can look at your homeowner policy. Look at your homeowner policy. There is a specific exclusion from your insurance company on any damage done by a commercial atomic reactor. You lose your house, you lose your health, you lose your family, you got to go to the federal government. They are not liable. Dominion Energy is not liable for the damage done by North Anna or Surrey in excess of $11 billion, and which is in a pool put together by all the nuclear utilities. That's the law. You know, it's gradually going up to $11 billion. Is a drop in the bucket. Think about September 11th, 2001, when that first jet crashed into the World Trade Center. If that jet had dived down and flew right over Indian Point, which is 35 miles north of Manhattan, if it had hit one or two of the reactors at Indian Point, you wouldn't have 3,000 dead. You'd have hundreds of thousands. Incalculable health damage, incalculable property damage. $2-3 trillion. Think of a radioactive cloud going over Westchester County, up Long Island Sound, over Long Island, up to Martha's Vineyard, into Cape Cod. I mean, you know, it's apocalyptic. The only term you can use to describe it is apocalyptic. They are not liable. They can walk away. They did, actually. Well, no, the people didn't file claims at 3 Mile Island. They tried to. There was a class action suit at 3 Mile Island. I went into Central Pennsylvania the year after the accident. I did not tell this to the Teabaggers. This wouldn't have resonated with them. I believe I was the only reporter to go in a year later. Many reporters, you know, went to 3 Mile Island during the accident. And somebody, the Village Voice, ran a piece on tracking the health of a lot of these people. Those reporters were decimated. The journalists who went into TMI died in droves. It was a nightmare. I wouldn't go anywhere near the place. But I did go a year later, and I interviewed dozens of people. It was the worst week of my life. Cancer, leukemia, birth defects, stillbirths, sterility, open lesions, metal taste in their mouth, hair falling out, farm animals dying in droves. I mean, the only piece other than mine was the Baltimore News American, which no longer exists, sent a team of reporters into central Pennsylvania to interview farmers about what happened to these animals. It was, you know, it was like a Japanese science fiction movie. It's horrifying. Absolutely horrifying. Anybody who tells you that nobody died at 3 Mile Island just doesn't know what they're talking about. But the people sued. It was a class action lawsuit, 2,400 families. And they go into federal court, and the judge says, there's not enough radiation escaped, therefore you have no case. And they never got a jury trial. Never got a jury trial in 3 Mile Island. And the Nuclear Regulatory Commission admitted to Congress they don't know how much radiation escaped at 3 Mile Island. There's no way to know because in the middle of the accident, all the stack monitors, there's monitors on the exhaust pipes coming out of the reactor, they were saturated with liquid and they became inoperable. They don't know how much radiation escaped, they don't know where it went, they don't know who was harmed by it. The only reasonably credible studies that were done on the health of people at 3 Mile Island were done by people in the area. There were a few women who went in, blocked off and went into a few of the neighborhoods and did carefully monitored interviews, anecdotal interviews with people, and compiled a terrifying record where in some areas they went into lower Swatara Township, they found virtually every house had a cancer or a leukemia case. Catastrophic. Just recently we had to date, the definitive study of the health impacts of Chernobyl. It was published by the New York Academy of Sciences. It was done by 3 Russian scientists. One of them is deceased. And they estimated, they took every article they could find that was ever published about Chernobyl. And there were a lot of them, actually. And then they did their own surveys, and they concluded that the death toll from Chernobyl was probably around 980,000 people that were killed at Chernobyl. And it's staggering. I went to Kiev in 1996. again, horrifying, 10 years after the Nukes. Absolutely horrifying. One of the things that I encountered in writing about Chernobyl, there's two, I mentioned this afternoon, doing my research lately, I've come across two staggering figures that I was sure were typographic errors. The first one was, I was reading about Chernobyl, and somewhere, someone, matter of fact, mentioned that the Soviet Union sent 800,000 draftees through the Chernobyl plant to help clean it up. And I was sure that it had to be a typo. They couldn't have got that right. It turns out it was 100% right. And what the Soviet Union did was all these guys who were in the military, they trucked them into Chernobyl, they sent them through the plant for a minute or 90 seconds. They would run through the plant and, pick up a piece of equipment or mop a floor or, unfasten a bolt, and then they'd run out. And then they'd send them back home and they'd bring another 5,000 guys. And they did this over and over again. These guys were called liquidators. And weirdly enough, Jimmy Carter played that role. In 1952, there was a meltdown at a reactor in Canada. And Jimmy Carter was in the nuclear Navy. And they ran him through, just like anybody else. It's in his autobiographies. Which is why Jimmy Carter always kind of glowed. You think he had that kind of really white teeth and stuff. So I thought that was a typo, but it turned out to be accurate. And I actually met many of these guys. After my going to this conference in Kiev, I was asked to speak in Kaliningrad, which is in Russia. But Russia, there's a piece of Russia that's next to Poland on one side and Lithuania on the other. It's detached from the actual Russia, but it's still part of Russia. And I spoke at a rally there. And the rally was sponsored by these liquidator guys. And boy, I remember the Vietnam Vets Against the War. That was one angry group of people. These guys, man, you understood why the Soviet Union fell when you met these guys. I mean, they were just ferocious. And they were all dying. They were all dying. I mean, from 90 seconds of exposure to Chernobyl. The other typo that I thought was a typo that turned out to be true is about a couple months ago I read an article that said, it was from the American University Journalist Project, and it said that in the last 10 years, the nuclear power industry has spent $645 million promoting new nuclear plants. I just thought that was outrageous, and they must have had it wrong. But they didn't. It was all based on Senate filings. And it's all lobbying. It's not even media purchases. It's all lobbying. They're required under the law, since they are a lobbying organization, to file with the Senate, U.S. Senate. $645 million in the last 10 years only on lobbying. And so if you're wondering where the nuclear renaissance is coming from, this is it. You have a technology that now, as I mentioned, can't get private financing. Where they're going to get financing is going to be from the federal government. How's it going to happen? Well, they can't get direct. The government can't go in and pay for the reactors. So what they're doing is they're going to make loan guarantees. So that any private company that comes forward, their loan is going to be underwritten by the taxpayer. Now, there has been studies done by the Government Accounting Office and others that in the Office of Management and Budget that say that they expect a 50% failure rate on these loans. Only 50%. But, they're pushing ahead with it anyway. So in 2007, they first proposed $50 billion. In 2005, when Bush, they got $18.5 billion. The Department of Energy couldn't figure out how to spend the money, and it never got spent. Actually, it was very complicated to do loan guarantees, and none of the projects were far enough along. So then, in 2007, Bush came back, and they wanted $50 billion. This was Pete Domenici, who was a senator from New Mexico, and is thankfully gone. But he was basically the senator from nuclear power. So he proposed $50 billion, and they were going to get it in a walk. And this is a tribute to our organizing ability, by the way. The 1,000 nuclear plants that Nixon proposed, they had in the year 2000, there were 103. And a lot of that has, some of it was much of it was economics. But if we hadn't marched, if we hadn't demonstrated, if we hadn't got arrested at the plants, they'd have probably got pretty close to 1,000. I mean, they would have gotten federal subsidies. We were able to stop the federal subsidies and stop a lot of these reactors from being built. that tells you you can't fight City Hall, is a messenger from City Hall. It's a myth. We beat the pants off these guys. There would have been, who knows how many, 500, 300? There would have been a hell of a lot more nuclear plants if we hadn't got a demonstration. And by the way, you would have never heard about 3 Mile Island had it not been for the demonstrations. I'll never forget. When we first started, I went to the University of Michigan. I was the senior editor of the newspaper there. And I was the UPI correspondent and the Time magazine correspondent. We had an AD machine in the building there. I was a senior editor. And we were totally, this was the middle of the war. We were reading everything that was coming off the wires. And I thought we were totally well informed. This was my senior year, 1966, 67 was my senior year. And I thought we knew everything. Of course, I was 23. You always know everything when you're 22 to 23. But in 1974, when we first started fighting the nukes, I got all the books I could read about nuclear power, and I came across one called We Almost Lost Detroit. Who knows that we almost lost Detroit? None of you. One. John G. Fuller wrote a book called We Almost Lost Detroit. He worked for that radical leftist magazine, Reader's Digest. And he told the story of a meltdown that occurred at the Fermi 1 nuclear plant in Monroe, Michigan. And they were on the brink of a major explosion because Fermi 1 was cooled with liquid sodium, which will explode if it's exposed to air. And so I'm reading this book, and I'm terrified because they were trying to figure out how to evacuate Detroit. Of course, General Motors has figured it out. Just go bankrupt and people will leave. Detroit is being evacuated, but not in the face of a radioactive cloud. And I'm reading this book, and suddenly I realized it was October 5th, 1966. I was 40 miles away. I was a newsman. I never heard a word about this thing. Nobody knew it. Hubert Humphrey spoke in Monroe, Michigan the next morning, and later died of cancer, as a matter of fact. And he didn't know. They didn't tell him that, oh, Mr. Vice President, by the way, there's a slight problem at the nuclear plant a mile away. Maybe you might want to wear a respirator. I mean, there was nothing. He was campaigning. And I was horrified. 3 Mile Island, we had our demonstrations in Seabrook in 76, 77, 78. And we educated the media, basically. In 77, we had 1,414 people arrested at Seabrook. And I don't know how many of you remember this, but the governor, this lunatic governor, came in. They locked everybody up in the National Guard armies. And we were in these Guard armies. We had 1,000 people at the beginning in the National Guard armies because he was demanding bail. And a lot of people didn't have the money, but a lot of people wouldn't give bail. That's part of the Quaker deal. And after 2 weeks, there were still 550 people in the armies. And they'd be there still but finally he caved in. And then that 2 weeks is what educated everybody about nuclear power. We wanted to get educated. And then we had another big demonstration there in 78. We had 20,000 people. And so the media, and then Jane Fonda decided to make the China Symbol, which came out exactly the same time as 3 Mile Island. But if we hadn't had all that happen, you would have never heard about 3 Mile Island. 3 Mile Island would have been a paragraph, in the newspapers. But as it was, Walter Cronkite and all these other guys were running out to see the China Symbol. And that's how it became an issue. So never think that what we do, with small groups of people doesn't have a huge impact. So I'm going to sort of work my way over to Solartopia now. When we first started fighting, everybody said, well, you don't want these nuclear plants. What do you want? How are we going to get the energy? Where is all the power going to come from? And we said, solar power, wind energy. We had no idea where it was coming from. I mean, it was all very nascent, essentially. And we did have what turned out to be, it was a lot of fun. We didn't realize how important it was. In 1975, we had something called the Tour Tomorrow Fair in Amherst, Massachusetts. Because there was a professor at UMass named William Hieronymus who had a vision of very large windmills in the ocean. Everybody said he was crazy. He was a gyro gurus of whatever. And these were going to be 5 megawatt, stations in the ocean that were going to generate huge quantities of power. And he did these diagrams and all this other stuff. And then there was also a guy at UMass named Amory Lovins, who I'm sure you've heard of, the great guru of megawatts and energy efficiency. And so they were at this conference. And we basically said, look, we can have a renewable energy world. We can have and solar eventually, if we take the money that's going to go into nukes, put it instead into these alternative technologies, and now I consider nuclear power to be the alternative technology, then we can have wind and solar. And we were very clear that leftists that we were, we wanted community control. We saw renewable energy as a way to get away from the control of the energy grid by the large corporations. And this we did over a few days period of time in 75. So we went up to Seabrook and we went to other places. We did have this model that we could have a green power, although wasn't the terminology. We didn't have that terminology at the time. And so for the next 30 years, this carried on. And but it was all theoretical. But lo and behold, the money somehow came around, and there have been these advances in renewable energy. In the 1990s, for example, there was a big debate in Denmark over whether to build nuclear plants. Very specific. There was no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Nuclear plants or not. Denmark had a huge green movement, a green party, and they won. They said no nukes were built in Denmark. So what happened? There were 4 big farm implement companies in Denmark, and they jumped into wind power. Vestas, Bonus, 2 others, and so Micron, and then another one I can't remember the name. And so they jumped in, they made a fortune. And by the late 1990s, they took wind power to the utility scale. They started taking, Denmark had a long history with wind power, and small wind. The windmills in Europe 1,000 years ago. There were windmills in Persia in the 1500s. It's not, for grinding grain and pumping water. In the 1930s, there were tens of thousands of windmills all across the Great Plains generating electricity. These were Jacobs windmills, like early Volkswagens. They never ran out. They were great machines. But, they went by the board when the Rural Electrification Agency came in. But, by the 1990s, out of Denmark and some other countries in Europe, you're getting really big windmills. And it turns out these things are really profitable. They are very efficient. They generate very large quantities of electricity, and they last a long time. In 1996, after I was at Kiev and Kaliningrad, thankfully I had the good sense to fly home through Copenhagen. If you ever get to go to Copenhagen, go to Copenhagen. It's incredibly beautiful. And I went out one day, this is at the end of April, and I got on top of one of these windmills. So 200 feet high. I have never been colder in my life. The wind just blowing off the Baltic. Forget it. But, it was a great feeling. You could look all across and this windows, but they shut it down for me to go up there. And they pioneered it. And they worked. Now, Jerry Brown when Jerry Brown was governor, some things never changed. Jerry Brown's running for governor again. He's probably going to win. But between 76 and 84, he put in tax credits in California. And they got 17,000 windmills in California. Some of which, by the way, we're trying to shut down because they're killing birds, but that's another story. So wind power became a reality. Wind power today is very, very profitable. We have enough wind in this country, wind potential between the Mississippi and the Rockies to generate 3 times as much electricity as the whole country uses. You wouldn't do it because of the transmission, right? It's expensive. But the existing windmills, you could plop them. You could plop windmills in North Dakota, Kansas, and West Texas, not even East Texas, West Texas, and get 100% of the electricity the country uses. So you're going to see windmills all over places. They're going to go offshore. They're going to go in Lake Erie. They're going to go places you don't. Well, there's 4 windmills in northern Ohio that 10 years ago would not have happened. But the technology has advanced. The city of Bowling Green installed these windmills in the town dump, and they are very profitable. There is a ton of money to be made in wind power. And like I say, it can power the whole country. Solar power, now we were talking about primarily photovoltaic cells. Yes?
Can I tell you something? It keeps like a contradiction from what you were just talking about earlier in the nuclear lab. And with I work in the industry, there are tax credits, which are another form of subsidy.
There's subsidies, but
It's
they're
a
not.
same contradiction between what you're saying, loan guarantees for nuclear lab, subsidies, and credits for wind power.
Well, because wind power actually works. And It also, when you subsidize wind power, you are dealing with externalities. You know, there's not a level playing field. I would argue right now, I would take a totally free market in energy right now. I would abolish all subsidies. But I would install a tax on carbon and on externalities. Okay? Now, if you had a totally free market in energy, every nuclear power plant would shut down because they can't get insurance. No utility company is going to run a nuclear plant without federal liability insurance. So we'll start right there. Then they're subsidized for the waste. You know, it was not always a given that the federal government was going to take responsibility for having nuclear waste. This is a bad deal that Jimmy Carter made, and he had no business making the deal. In his administration, he went to the nuclear industry and said, "Oh, I'll take your waste." Thank you, Jimmy. Let's send it down the plains. I mean, you know, it's not cool. They are also subsidized for their fuel. They're subsidized for the damage they do to the environment. You know, taking Lake Anna to 100 degrees for the steam that comes out. None of that comes out with wind. The only externalities with wind that I've seen, a couple of the windmills kill birds. And you really have to work these days with, well, you're in the industry, with a large-scale windmill to kill birds. Now, they found a way to kill bats in West Virginia. And it has to do with a certain vibration they think, you know, I'm not sure about that. Windmills don't kill birds unless you put them in a specific spot, like Altamont Pass, California. Some of the original windmills built in California were built in Altamont Pass, which is a narrow canyon east of San Francisco. These are old, small, very fast wind machines. And they also have latticework towers. And so the birds perch on the towers and they see the squirrels or the prairie dogs or whatever, and they die and they get clunked by the windmills. Now we're trying to get them to take these windmills down and put big, slow. Now they're not slow at the tip, but you know these big machines. It takes a really suicidal bird to fly in them. And very, very small bird kill. Certainly not compared to skyscrapers or birds or feral cats, for God's sakes. So, but it's, you know, coal is subsidized, oil is subsidized, gas is subsidized. Nukes can't live without subsidies. Wipe out all the subsidies, as far as I'm concerned, and bring them in. Then solar and wind will let them compete in the market. They'll win. I mean, solar and wind is much cheaper at this point in time. And let's talk about PV. When we started photovoltaic cells convert sunlight to electricity. Do you have enough light, by the way? Are you okay with it? Okay. It's a heck of a camera.
I have access to the light station.
We're good.
You're good? Okay. Do you have enough light? You know what I look like. You know me. So I go around turning off lights, by the way. I turned off at least 100 lights at the University of Virginia. And then again at my cell, I turn on all the lights. I want to start a national campaign. I'm going to write an article about it. Turn off lights. I teach at 2 colleges in Central Ohio. I turn off dozens of lights. I walk down the hall. This room's empty. Turn off lights. That's amazing.
Then are you okay with me turning on the lights?
If you want to, it's up to you guys. We'll turn them off quick enough, I guess. Well, I'll go write an exercise bike and turn on some interesting. So, photovoltaic cells, when we first started, were pretty theoretical in terms of mass distribution. PV was invented, the science was known in the early 1800s, and then the photovoltaics were developed for general use at the Bell Labs in the early 1950s for the space program. The first used solar panels went up on the Vanguard satellite. So, and now, of course, PV is a huge industry. I think photovoltaics will vastly outstrip the wind business, ultimately. I think, you know, they say the counter argument is, well, you need an area the size of Arizona to supply the United States. In fact, you need an area in the Nevada or Arizona desert 90 miles on the side, and you can generate 100% of the electricity in the United States. But that's not the way you do it. You put them on rooftops. In Virginia, in Los Angeles, in Ohio, photovoltaics on rooftops will work, and then you have no transmission loss and no transmission costs. And with the amorphous silicon, soft silicon. There's two primary kinds right now. You have crystalline silicon, which goes in wafers and goes in closed panels, which are more efficient right now, but they're more vulnerable to certain problems. Or you have amorphous, which can go into roofing shingles. And I've been to a factory west of Detroit where they just have one big machine. It's 350 yards long, and it just produces these roofing shingles that you then put on your roof and you plug them in. And they are getting to be cost effective. I hate to say it, but you know who's going to make them cost effective, which is the Chinese. The Chinese are pouring huge amounts of money into renewable technology. Every cent that we're spending in Iraq and Afghanistan, they're spending on renewable energy, and they're going to leave us in the dust, unfortunately. That's the way it's going. So, at any rate, photovoltaics have come along. They are cost competitive with nukes, especially if we would get rid of the subsidies. We have various other technologies. So, what happened to me was how Solartopia came about was I got a grant in the early 2000s to write a book about hydrogen, because there was a moment there where hydrogen was, the solution du jour. And it turned, so I took the grant and I started to write the book, and I realized it's nonsense. Hydrogen's not an answer to anything. It's a medium of carrying energy, not an energy source. You have to produce hydrogen, and you get out what you put in, pretty much. So, but I spent the money, so I decided I would write a book that would portray, okay, what do we need? What will give us a green power? And so I set up a theoretical plane ride from Hamburg to Honolulu, and we start over Copenhagen. And, this is in 2030. But I made a point of not having any miraculous breakthroughs between now and then. I used theoretically only available technology. And you can do it. If we wanted to, we could shut down every nuclear, coal, oil, and gas facility in the world and replace them with available technology in renewables, and the lights wouldn't blink. I mean, the technology is there. The resources are there. The potential energy is there from renewables. Now, we would have to combine it with increased efficiency and restore the mass transit system, which is a big deal. This country, here's a conspiracy theory that we know is true. This is a conspiracy theory that's an actual conspiracy. In 1923, the president of General Motors, Alfred P. Sloan, wrote a memo to his compatriots saying, look, our competitors are not Ford and Studebaker. Our competitors are the public transportation system. We need to get rid of the interstate passenger rail system and the commuter rail trolley systems in all our cities. And they conspired with Standard Oil and the glass and rubber companies over the next 30 years. And they destroyed the public transportation systems in at least 80 cities in the United States, including Los Angeles. Have you seen Who Framed Roger Rabbit? Okay, if you were able to figure out what the movie was about, which is hard to do, it was about destroying the Red Line. You could go on the Red Line in California from Santa Monica to the Valley, all over Los Angeles, before the interstate system and get anywhere for a nickel or a dime. They set out to destroy it. Who Framed Roger Rabbit is about destroying Tubetown to put in a clover to, for an auto exchange. Columbus, Ohio, we had trolleys, I remember, when I was growing up. Detroit, the trolley cars from Detroit wound up in Hiroshima. They actually sold the cars from Detroit to the city of Hiroshima. What can I tell you? And, of course, passenger rail. I live in a city, the biggest city in the Western world, I think, that has no passenger rail service, Columbus, Ohio. You cannot leave Columbus, Ohio on a train. And the federal government has now given us a grant, Ohio grant, for $400 million to simply run a train from Cincinnati to Dayton to Columbus to Cleveland. And the Republicans are opposing it. They don't even want to do a study. They said we should have spent the money on a study until we do a study. You know where that's going. So anyway, if you took solar and wind and increased efficiency, restore the mass transit system, go with geothermal, ocean thermal, tidal energy, which is really cute. Have you seen a tidal wave? these things. They're like big sausages. And they just sit out there and they go up and down. They have 2 moving parts each side. And then they squish water and goes through a tube onto land, and that generates electricity. I mean, they're remarkable. The only problem with them is they're going to wind up with graffiti because they're going to go out there and paint nasty stuff. But that'll be cool. What the heck? And every time I turn around, there's a new breakthrough. LED lighting. First we have incandescent bulbs. They're gone. Then we go to compact fluorescents. They're going to be gone. Then we're going to have LEDs. I guess LSDs are part of the market. We'll have LEDs, and they're going to be transcended. There's something else coming in after LEDs. And we just waste enormous quantities of energy, like I said, going around turning off lights. So we have the technology, and that's Solartopia. There's no, in this book I have the guy, or woman, the big rap on Solartopia is there's no steps. Sorry, I haven't figured out how to do that. I have some very provocative descriptions of the power towers out west, these giant towers that generate electricity from the sun, but even that's a bit of a stretch. So the bottom line is, to get to Solartopia, we have the technology. There's just no doubt about it. And the corporations don't want us. But very quickly, there are 5 additional steps beyond the technological transformation that we have to take. Number 1, the most important thing, is that we have to redefine the corporation. Now, nobody ever talks about this stuff, but this is the stuff that really is going to make it possible. We have, as everybody in this room knows, corporations run this country. It was not always this way. Tom Jefferson warned against the money aristocracy. Lincoln, in the middle of the Civil War, said he was more afraid of the corporations than he was of the Confederacy. And he should know, because he worked for them. He was a railroad worker, actually. And so corporations, there is a chartering operation for corporations. Corporations run at the behest of the government. And thanks to the Supreme Court, since 1880, they've had personhood. And now this Supreme Court says they have total access to the Bill of Rights. They can spend all the money they want on federal elections. It's not sustainable. We are not going to crack the nature of our political system until we defeat the corporation as an institution. Now people say, oh, well, you can't do it. But look, we've had monarchs, we've had popes, we've had dictators, we've had clan chiefs, we've had whatever. And so, it's something we just have to do. And, I remember just as a monarch looking at the University of Virginia, I actually saw some black students. That wouldn't have happened, X number of years ago. The enrollment of men and women is almost equal now. According to our guide, the first woman undergraduate co-ed was admitted in 1970. That's only 40 years ago. And now women are a majority. Anybody that doubts women are going to take over this country, look at the college enrollments. So things do change, and more rapidly than we think. So the corporation, we have to bust the corporation. We have to get rid of waste and war. 2 small items. First of all, recycling. The question of waste is not a rear-end problem. It's amazing how tens of millions of people in this country, including in my neighborhood, will recycle with absolutely no financial incentive. Nobody's paid a dime for taking all that stuff and schlepping the blue bin out to the am I being paid to do this? Well, no, but we all do it. In my neighborhood, everybody has it. On Monday morning, there's the blue bins. And totally without financial incentive. The problem is at the front end. No corporation nobody should be allowed to manufacture anything that cannot be 100% recycled. We still don't have, I guess there's an exception here, there's no place in Columbus I can take batteries. This country uses more than 1 billion batteries a year. Where do they go? Who knows? Why isn't there a federal program to collect batteries? It's insane. Plastics. Why do we have 11 different kinds of plastic? What do you do with all these plastics? They don't get recycled. They're not only shipped away. They don't break down. We now, with plastic, I think it's illegal to buy water in bottles, frankly, plastic bottles. There's now apparently an island twice the size of Texas in the Pacific Ocean of nothing but plastic bottles. And it's got a gargantuan problem. What's that?
Cheap land.
Yeah, cheap land. It's not cheap. It's made all made with petroleum. It's a huge waster of oil. You know, simultaneously war. I wanted to keep it to 8 steps to Greek Solartopia because there are 8 steps in Buddhism. So just a little synchronicity there. So although David Letterman has 10, someday I fantasize having David Letterman list the 10 steps to Solartopia. We'll see if it happens. But war, of course, has got to stop. You know, we spend, the United States spends more money on our military than all the rest of the countries of the world combined. And for what? To protect us from Canada and Mexico. I mean, we don't want those damn Canadians taking over our country. Although I would, because then we'd have health care. But, it's completely wasting money. Everything that goes into the military is meant for destruction. There's nothing good about military spending. It's got to stop. Okay? Food. Everything needs to be raised organic. Pesticides, herbicides, chemical fertilizers are not sustainable. They destroy the land. They taint our food. Having lived on an organic farm for 14 years, I know the stuff will come up without pesticides and without herbicides. And my understanding is that massive amounts of pesticides were introduced to mainstream American farming only after World War II. And at the time, commercial farmers were losing 17% of their produce to pests. And then the pesticides were introduced, and the productivity went down, and then the pests, of course, have gotten immunities, and now, even with the spray, we lose 17% of the crops to the pests. So, it's got to stop. With that, by the way, is the more controversial issue of meat. Can we sustain the raising of beef and chickens and hogs the way we do? The answer is not if we use CAFOs. That's a big issue here. Concentrated agricultural feeding, concentrated animal feeding operations, CAFOs. You have them in Virginia for hogs. They have these huge lagoons of animal waste, which break and go into rivers, like the New River, which was utterly decimated. So, how many of you have been on a feedlot? I've been on a cattle feedlot. In Ohio, we have egg farms. These chickens are in cages like this. They had a fire at an egg farm in Ohio a week ago. They killed 250,000 chickens. Can you imagine? I mean, it's staggering. Biblical plagues of flies. And with the cows, the chickens, the pigs are just unbelievable. And even the turkeys is a problem now. That's all got to stop. It's not sustainable. We can't do it. What convinced me, I became a vegetarian in 1970 because we were killing animals on the farm, and I just didn't want to do it anymore. But what really nailed it for me was Diet for a Small Planet. If you want to read a book about food, read Francis Ford Hayes' Diet for a Small Planet. We really have to eat lower on the food chain. So that's food, and then social justice, number 4. So we can't, a society that's not socially just, that has huge differential between rich and poor, is not sustainable. You cannot continue to do it. Even this beautiful mall, which is what it is, have panhandlers if people don't have a place to live, people who don't have a place enough to eat. You can't have that in an advanced society and expect it to sustain itself. You look at Greece, you look at Rome, you look at all the great empires, their downfall was 2 things: military spending and bifurcation of rich and poor. And when you get in this country, when you get that kind of thing, people were alienated, you can't sustain the country. In the United States, the differentiation between rich and poor started to narrow in 1933. The New Deal worked. Imagine our country without Social Security and unemployment insurance and Medicare and Medicaid, which came later with the New Deal, and all these social programs. They did narrow the gap between rich and poor, and it makes a big difference. We can't do that. We can't have that. Part of having social democracy is counting the votes. Now, I live in Central Ohio. I saw the 2004 election stolen. We cannot sustain electronic voting machines. They are perfectly devised to steal elections. We have to have paper ballots, universal paper ballots, hand counted. We advocate, my co-author and I, Bob Fitrakis, we advocate you vote on Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday, so everybody can vote. This voting on Tuesday until 7 o'clock means that working people can't vote. It's ridiculous. 4 days of voting, and then on the 5th day, on Tuesday, you have a day off. All the high school and college students come out and they count the You also need to have automatic voter registration. Everybody when they're 18 should be automatically registered to vote. Why do we have to have voter registration cards? It's ridiculous. So that's democracy. And finally, the last point. I did this book, and I created this perfect picture of, a sustainable plan, organic food, all that stuff, corporations broken, so on and so forth. And then somebody read it and they said, well, what about population explosion? What about too many people? Now, as the father of 5 children, I have to be careful what I say here. My excuse is that I was in the anti-nuclear movement for 30 years and I didn't know that I had married a fast breeder. I don't say that in her presence, so don't tell her I said it. But the only way to control population is to empower women. Women are the ones who will decide ultimately how many children there should be. When women are educated, when they have equal access to education, when they're equally paid, when they have access to birth control and reproductive rights, population plummets. It doesn't just even out, it plummets. It's poverty that really drives, or lack of good sense, that really drives, large population. But if you look at Italy, look at Spain, you look at Quebec, you look at countries where women have really risen up in the power structure, population in Japan, also population goes way down. And so those are the 5 additional steps to Solartopia. So is Solartopia possible? Absolutely. It's possible technologically. The question is it going to be possible politically? And on Thursday, we're going to see the energy bill and we're going to see what we're up against. So thank you very much. Thank you for your time.